The stars stretched endlessly before the exploration vessel Aurora, as it drifted through the outer edges of human space. Captain Jake Morrison stood on the bridge, watching the viewscreen display a sector of space that no human had ever visited before. His crew had been out here for 6 months, mapping new systems and searching for signs of intelligent life. They had found plenty of planets, some with basic organisms, but nothing that could talk back. Until today. The sensor alarm chirped softly, and Lieutenant Amy Carter looked up from her station. Her fingers moved quickly across the console as she tried to understand what the sensors were telling her. 3 large objects had just appeared on their scopes, moving in perfect formation toward the Aurora. They were ships, but their design was unlike anything in the human database. Jake felt his heart rate increase. This was it. First contact. Everything they had trained for. Everything humanity had hoped for and feared in equal measure. He straightened his uniform and took a deep breath. The next few minutes would either open a door to the stars or slam it shut forever. The alien ships were massive, each one at least 3 times the size of the Aurora. Their hulls gleamed with an unusual metallic sheen that seemed to shift colors as they moved. Strange symbols covered their surfaces, glowing faintly in the darkness of space. The ships arranged themselves in a triangle formation around the Aurora, effectively boxing it in. Amy checked her tactical displays and confirmed what Jake already suspected. Those ships were heavily armed. Energy signatures indicated weapon systems far more advanced than anything Earth had developed. If this turned hostile, the Aurora would not survive. A communication signal came through, but it was not in any human language. The ship's computer worked frantically to decode it, searching for patterns and mathematical constants that might serve as a bridge between species. After several tense minutes, a rough translation appeared on Jake's screen. The message was simple and direct. The aliens identified themselves as representatives of the Xanthari Collective, a coalition of species that controlled much of this region of space. They demanded that the Aurora power down its engines and prepare to receive a diplomatic envoy. It was not phrased as a request. Jake gave the order to comply. The Aurora's engines reduced to minimal power, just enough to maintain life support and basic systems. Within an hour, a small shuttle detached from the largest Xanthari vessel and approached. Jake and his senior officers assembled in the main airlock to greet their visitors. The airlock doors opened with a hiss of equalizing pressure. 3 beings entered, and Jake had to consciously keep his expression neutral. The lead figure was unlike anything he had imagined. It stood nearly 7 feet tall, its body composed of what appeared to be living crystal. Facets caught the light and threw rainbow patterns across the walls. Behind it came 2 shorter beings, their bodies covered in dark scales and multiple eyes that seemed to look in different directions simultaneously. The crystalline being spoke, and this time the translation was cleaner. The computer had learned enough to provide real-time interpretation. The being introduced itself as Diplomat Vex of the Xanthari Collective. Its voice had a musical quality like wind chimes in a breeze. Jake introduced himself and his crew, explaining that they represented Earth and humanity. He kept his tone friendly and respectful, following all the protocols that had been drilled into him during training. This was humanity's chance to join the galactic community, and he would not mess it up. Vex listened to Jake's introduction, its crystalline head tilting slightly. When Jake finished, there was a long pause. Then Vex began to explain the Xanthari Collective and its place in the galaxy. They were the dominant power in this region, Vex said. 12 species had joined together under Xanthari leadership to create order and stability. They maintained peace through strength and clear hierarchy. Jake nodded along, trying to understand the political structure Vex described. It sounded almost feudal, with stronger species at the top and weaker ones serving beneath them. Not exactly the equal partnership humanity had hoped for, but perhaps there was room for negotiation. Then Vex got to the point. Humanity had ventured into Xanthari space. Their presence had been noted and evaluated. After careful consideration, the collective had decided to offer Earth a place within their structure. Humanity would become a tributary species, providing resources and labor to the collective in exchange for protection and guidance. Jake felt his stomach drop. This was not a negotiation. This was a demand for submission. He glanced at Amy, who stood rigid beside him, her face carefully neutral. The other officers showed similar restraint, but Jake could see the anger in their eyes. He chose his words carefully. Earth appreciated the collective's interest, he said, but humanity valued its independence. They had come in peace, seeking friendship and mutual exchange, not subjugation. Perhaps they could discuss a different arrangement, one based on equality and cooperation. Vex's crystalline form seemed to dim slightly. The diplomat explained with what might have been patience or condescension that all new species joined the collective as tributaries. It was not a matter for debate. The strong led and the weak followed. This was the natural order. Humanity should be grateful for the opportunity to join such a powerful coalition. Jake felt his jaw tighten. He had faced difficult negotiations before, but never one where the other side simply refused to acknowledge any position but their own. He tried again, speaking more firmly. Earth would not surrender its sovereignty. They were willing to establish diplomatic relations, trade agreements, cultural exchanges, anything that respected both parties' autonomy. But they would not become servants to anyone. The temperature in the room seemed to drop. Vex stood completely still for several seconds, and Jake wondered if he had just made a terrible mistake. Then the diplomat spoke again, its musical voice now carrying an edge of something cold and sharp. No species had ever refused the collective's offer. The fact that humanity dared to do so was either incredible bravery or incredible stupidity. Vex suspected the latter. The collective did not tolerate disobedience or disrespect. If Earth would not join willingly, they would be made to join by force. Jake opened his mouth to respond, but Amy suddenly grabbed his arm. Her eyes were locked on her handheld scanner. The Xanthari ships were powering up their weapons. Jake barely had time to process this information before alarms began shrieking throughout the Aurora. Vex and the other Xanthari calmly walked back to their shuttle without another word. Jake sprinted for the bridge, his officers right behind him. He shouted orders as he ran, telling the crew to raise shields and prepare for evasive maneuvers, but he knew it was already too late. The first blast hit the Aurora's port side, tearing through the shield generators like they were not even there. The ship lurched violently, throwing Jake against a bulkhead. Emergency lights flickered on as main power failed. Another blast followed, and Jake felt the deck shudder beneath his feet. On the view screen, he could see the two human escort ships that had accompanied the Aurora. They were trying to maneuver, trying to return fire, but the Xanthari weapons cut through them effortlessly. One ship exploded in a brief, brilliant flash. The other broke apart, its hull peeling open like a flower. Amy made it to her station and began working frantically. She reported that the Aurora had lost main engines and life support was failing. They had minutes at best. Jake made the hardest decision of his life. He ordered all hands to the escape pods. As the crew evacuated, Jake stayed on the bridge long enough to activate the emergency beacon. It would broadcast everything that had happened here, sending the data back to Earth through the relay network. It would take weeks for the message to arrive, but at least Earth would know what was coming. Jake was the last one off the Aurora. As his escape pod drifted away from the dying ship, he watched the Xanthari vessels complete their work. The Aurora came apart in silence, just another piece of debris floating in the void. Far away in the heart of Xanthari space, the High Council received Vex's report. The news that a primitive species had refused their offer caused some surprise but mostly amusement. They had encountered stubborn species before. A show of overwhelming force always brought them to heel. The Council issued their orders. A military fleet would be assembled and sent to this Earth. The humans would be taught their place in the galactic order. The Council estimated it would take 3 standard cycles to completely subjugate the human homeworld. They saw no need for extensive planning or research. After all, how dangerous could one small planet be? None of them thought to ask why a species capable of building starships still remembered how to make weapons of war. The warning beacon from the Aurora reached Earth 3 weeks after the incident. Admiral Kyle Bennett sat in the command center beneath Geneva, watching the recorded message for the 5th time. Jake Morrison's face filled the screen, strained and urgent as he described the encounter with the Xanthari collective. The video ended with images of the alien ships opening fire. Kyle slammed his fist on the table. 23 good people dead because they dared to say no to alien bullies. He had served in the Navy for 30 years, worked his way up through the ranks, and commanded Earth's defense forces for the last 5. In all that time, He had prepared for the possibility of hostile first contact. He just never thought it would actually happen. The room filled with Earth's top military and political leaders. President Martinez stood at the head of the table, her face drawn with worry. She had been elected on a platform of peace and exploration, not war. Now she had to prepare her planet for an invasion by an enemy they knew almost nothing about. Dr. Lisa Morgan entered the room carrying a tablet filled with analysis. She was young for such an important position, only 32. But her work in xenotechnology had made her the leading expert on potential alien threats. She had spent the last 3 weeks studying every detail of the Aurora's sensor logs, trying to find weaknesses in Xanthari technology. Lisa laid out what they knew. The Xanthari had weapons that could overwhelm human shields with single shots. Their ships were larger and more powerful than anything Earth had built. Based on the energy signatures, they probably had faster engines too. She paused before delivering the worst news. Intelligence suggested the Xanthari could field hundreds of warships. Earth had 72 combat-capable vessels, most designed for patrol work and pirate hunting, not full-scale warfare. The room fell silent. Someone finally asked the question everyone was thinking. Could Earth win this fight? Lisa looked at Admiral Bennett, who met her eyes steadily. He spoke in a calm, measured tone. No, they probably could not win, but they could make the Xanthari pay for every inch of ground, and they could buy time for Earth to prepare better defenses. President Martinez authorized a full military mobilization. Shipyards went into overdrive, building new vessels and retrofitting civilian ships with weapons. Factories that made cars and appliances retooled to produce missiles and armor plating. Every person with military training was called back to active duty, and millions of civilians volunteered for the new militia program. The Xanthari fleet arrived 4 months after the Aurora incident. They came out of faster-than-light travel near Mars, their ships spreading out in a formation that spoke of absolute confidence. Admiral Bennett watched them on the tactical display, counting vessels and calculating odds. 312 Xanthari warships against his 72. He had faced worse odds before, but never with the survival of his entire species on the line. The Xanthari commander sent a message. It was brief and to the point. Humanity would surrender immediately and accept tributary status. Any resistance would be crushed without mercy. The message included images of other species that had resisted, their worlds burning and their populations enslaved. It was meant to terrify. Bennett recorded his response. Earth rejected the Xanthari demands. Humanity would never surrender its freedom. If the Xanthari wanted Earth, they would have to take it by force. He ended the transmission with words that would become famous across the galaxy. You have made a terrible mistake. You have declared war on Earth. The Battle of Mars began 30 minutes later. The Xanthari fleet advanced in perfect formation, their movements precise and coordinated. They had fought hundreds of battles using these same tactics, and they always worked. Overwhelming firepower applied with ruthless efficiency. Bennett split his fleet into smaller groups, ordering them to engage from multiple angles. The Xanthari energy shields proved just as effective as Lisa had feared. Human missiles and plasma weapons splashed harmlessly against them, but Bennett had not expected those weapons to work. He had a different plan. The first human ship to die was the destroyer Phoenix. It charged straight at a Xanthari cruiser, taking hit after hit, its armor melting under the alien weapons. When it got close enough, the Phoenix detonated its entire payload of nuclear warheads at point-blank range. The Xanthari shields held against the blast, but the electromagnetic pulse that followed shut down their systems for precious seconds. In those seconds, 3 more human ships unleashed their kinetic weapons. Solid slugs of depleted uranium, accelerated to incredible speeds, punched through the weakened shields and tore into the Xanthari hull. The cruiser broke apart, the first Xanthari casualty of the war, but the cost was high. For every Xanthari ship destroyed, Earth lost 5 or 6 of its own. Bennett watched his fleet dwindle, each lost ship representing hundreds of lives. He gave the order he had hoped to avoid. The human forces would conduct a fighting retreat back to Earth, making the Xanthari pay for every mile of space. The battle raged for 3 days. Human ships darted in and out, using hit-and-run tactics that frustrated the Xanthari commanders. They were used to orderly battles where opposing fleets lined up and traded fire until one side broke. This chaotic, desperate fighting was something new and unsettling. On the 3rd day, The human fleet made its final stand near Earth's moon. Bennett gathered his remaining 40 ships and prepared for one last push. He sent a message to all crews. They had done well, better than anyone expected. They had shown the Xanthari that humanity would not go quietly. Now it was time to buy a few more hours for the people on the ground. The final engagement was brutal. Human ships rammed Xanthari vessels when their weapons ran dry. Crews set their reactors to overload and used their ships as bombs. The Xanthari fleet finally broke through, but they had lost over 60 ships. The invasion that was supposed to be a quick demonstration of power had turned into a grinding, costly battle. As Xanthari landing craft began descending toward Earth, Colonel Danny Price assembled his forces. He commanded the defense of North America, with responsibility for protecting over 400 million people. His soldiers were dug in across major cities and strategic locations, but he knew they could not hold forever. The Xanthari troops were professional soldiers, well-trained and well-equipped. They established landing zones in rural areas, away from major population centers. Their doctrine called for securing bases, then methodically advancing to capture cities. It was the same approach they had used on a dozen worlds. What they did not expect was the resistance from civilians. As Xanthari patrols moved through the countryside, they encountered farmers with hunting rifles and improvised explosives. Small towns refused to evacuate, instead fortifying their positions and preparing to fight. The Xanthari were confused. In every other conquest, civilian populations fled or surrendered. These humans seemed determined to fight even when they had no chance of winning. In the city of Denver, Xanthari forces encountered their first urban combat. Colonel Price had fortified the downtown area, turning skyscrapers into fortresses and streets into kill zones. The Xanthari advanced confidently, expecting to sweep aside the human defenders. Instead, they found themselves fighting for every building, every floor, every room. The battle for Denver lasted 2 weeks. Human forces used every trick they could think of. They collapsed buildings on advancing Xanthari troops. They flooded tunnels where alien forces tried to move unseen. They set traps that exploited the Xanthari's reliance on their shields, using electrified wires and acid sprays that their energy barriers could not stop. When Denver finally fell, the Xanthari had lost over 3,000 soldiers. The human casualties were even higher, but the message was clear. Taking Earth would not be easy. Every city, every town, every farmhouse would be a battle. In orbit, the Xanthari fleet commander composed a message to the collective High Council. The invasion was proceeding, but slower than anticipated. These humans fought with a ferocity and creativity that was unprecedented. Their weapons were primitive, but they used them with devastating effectiveness. And most disturbing, they showed no sign of breaking. Even when defeat was certain, they kept fighting. The commander requested reinforcements. The council was surprised but agreed. They sent another 100 ships and 50,000 troops. It would be enough, they assured themselves. No species could stand against such force indefinitely. But deep in the underground command center, Admiral Bennett met with Dr. Lisa Morgan and Colonel Price. They reviewed the data from the first months of fighting. Yes, Earth was losing ground. Yes, casualties were mounting. But they were learning. Every engagement taught them something new about Xanthari tactics and technology. And Lisa's team was making progress on adapting human technology to counter the alien advantages. Bennett looked at the holographic map of Earth, seeing the red markers where Xanthari forces controlled territory. It was perhaps 20% of the planet, concentrated in less populated areas. The major cities still held. The industrial centers still produced weapons and supplies, and the human spirit remained unbroken. He thought about the Xanthari commander's message asking for reinforcements. The aliens still did not understand what they were facing. 3 months into the war, Dr. Lisa Morgan stood in her laboratory staring at pieces of a destroyed Xanthari fighter. Her team had been working around the clock, taking apart every bit of alien technology they could recover from the battlefield. The work was exhausting and dangerous, but it was starting to pay off. The breakthrough came at 2 in the morning. Lisa had been examining the shield generator, trying to understand how it created such powerful energy barriers. She ran current through it in different patterns, watching how it responded. On her 47th attempt, something clicked. The shield flickered and died when exposed to a specific electromagnetic frequency. Lisa immediately called Admiral Bennett. Within hours, every human weapons facility received new specifications. They began producing EMP weapons tuned to that exact frequency. It would not make the Zenthari shields useless, but it would weaken them enough for conventional weapons to get through. The playing field was starting to level. But Lisa's team did not stop there. They studied the wreckage of Zenthari ships and reverse-engineered their shield technology. Human understanding of physics was different from the Zenthari approach, which meant human shields would work differently too. Within 2 months, the first human ship equipped with energy shields rolled out of the shipyard. It was crude compared to Zenthari technology, but it worked. In space, Lieutenant Commander Sophie Blake was making her own kind of history. She commanded Ghost Squadron, a unit of 12 small, fast ships that had been painted matte black and equipped with stealth technology. Their job was to harass Zenthari supply lines and make life difficult for the occupation forces. Sophie had learned quickly that the Zenthari followed very predictable patterns. Their supply convoys traveled the same routes at the same times. Their patrols moved in regular circuits. They seemed unable or unwilling to change tactics even when those tactics clearly were not working. Ghost Squadron used this predictability against them. They would wait along supply routes, engines cold and systems powered down to avoid detection. When a Zenthari convoy passed by, they would light up their drives and attack from behind, targeting cargo ships instead of warships. By the time Zenthari escorts could respond, Ghost Squadron was already gone, disappearing into the dark. The Zenthari commanders were frustrated beyond measure. They sent faster ships to chase the ghosts. They increased patrol density. They tried changing routes. Nothing worked. Sophie and her pilots seemed to know exactly where to strike and when to vanish. The Zenthari had never faced an enemy that refused to stand and fight properly. On occupied Earth, Frank Hudson led a very different kind of resistance. He was a former construction worker from Ohio who found himself organizing guerrilla fighters across the Midwest. Frank had never served in the military, but he had common sense and creativity, which turned out to be more valuable than formal training. The Zenthari had taken over several small towns in rural areas, using them as bases for their operations. They expected the locals to either flee or cooperate. Instead, Frank and others like him began a campaign of sabotage and harassment that drove the aliens to distraction. The tactics were simple but effective. Cut power lines to Zenthari bases, contaminate their water supplies, set fires that required them to divert resources, leave fake intelligence that sent patrols to empty locations. The Zenthari soldiers never knew if the friendly human they met was actually a resistance fighter, waiting for the right moment to strike. One of Frank's most successful operations involved a Zenthari ammunition depot. His people spent 2 weeks digging a tunnel from a nearby basement. When they reached the depot, they did not steal anything or set explosives. Instead, they carefully replaced random bullets and power cells with defective ones. The Zenthari did not discover the sabotage until their weapons started failing in combat. The psychological impact was devastating. Zenthari soldiers began to question their equipment, their intelligence, everything. They became paranoid and jumpy, which made them more likely to make mistakes. The occupation forces that had seemed so confident at the start of the war were now looking over their shoulders constantly. Admiral Bennett watched these developments with satisfaction. Earth was not just surviving, it was adapting and evolving. Every day brought new tactics, new weapons, new ways to hurt the enemy. He decided it was time to go on the offensive. Operation Hammer Strike was the most ambitious human military action since the war began. Bennett had assembled a fleet of 40 ships, including 10 equipped with the new shield generators. Their target was the Zenthari occupation forces on Mars. The Red Planet had been under alien control since the first week of the invasion, and Bennett wanted it back. The attack came at dawn on the Martian colony of New Seattle. Human ships dropped out of faster-than-light travel right on top of the Zenthari fleet, catching them completely by surprise. The new EMP weapons fired first, weakening enemy shields. Then came the kinetic rounds and missiles, tearing into hulls that suddenly were not so well protected. The Zenthari tried to form their traditional defensive formation, But the human ships were not following any rules they recognized. Some ships flew in close for point-blank combat. Others hung back and provided covering fire. A few even went after targets that seemed tactically insignificant, just to create chaos and confusion. The battle lasted 6 hours. When it ended, the Centauri fleet over Mars had been destroyed or driven off. Human forces began landing on the planet, moving to liberate the colonies. The cost had been high, with 12 human ships lost, but they had achieved their objective. For the first time since the war started, Earth had taken back territory. The captured Centauri fleet commander was brought before Admiral Bennett. The alien was a towering creature with 4 arms and compound eyes that reflected light like mirrors. It looked at Bennett with something that might have been respect or might have been horror. Through a translator, Bennett asked why the Centauri were so unprepared for human tactics. The commander's answer was enlightening. In the collective, warfare was a formal affair with rules and protocols. Fleets met in open space, exchanged fire, until one side's shields failed. Then the losing side surrendered. Civilians did not fight. Soldiers did not hide or use deception. War was about raw power, not cunning. Bennett almost laughed. The Centauri had mastered the technology of war but forgotten its art. They had been at peace for so long, dominating weaker species, that they had forgotten what a real fight looked like. Humans had no such luxury. Earth's history was written in blood and conflict. Every human child learned about ancient battles, famous generals, brilliant tactics that turned the tide of wars. Captain Ethan Cross, who had been a marine biologist before the war, sat in on the interrogation. He had been analyzing Centauri behavior and had developed a theory. After the commander was taken away, Ethan shared his thoughts with Bennett. Humans were unique, Ethan said. Most species in the galaxy reached the stars because they evolved beyond conflict. They developed technology, discovered faster-than-light travel, and moved into space without ever really figuring out warfare. The Centauri collective dominated because they had slightly better weapons and tactics than everyone else, but none of them were really warriors. Humans were different. Earth had produced weapons alongside every other invention. Humans had fought wars even as they built civilizations. They had developed elaborate strategies for killing each other efficiently. It was dark and terrible, but it meant that humanity understood warfare at a fundamental level that other species did not. Bennett considered this. It explained why the Centauri seemed so confused by basic military tactics like ambushes, feints, and guerrilla warfare. These concepts were probably foreign to species that had evolved beyond such primitive behavior. Humans had not evolved beyond anything. They brought all their violent history with them into space. News of the victory on Mars spread across human-controlled space. Morale soared. If they could take back Mars, they could take back Earth. More volunteers signed up to fight. Factories increased production. Scientists worked harder to develop new weapons and countermeasures, but the victory had another effect that Bennett had not anticipated. Word of the battle reached other species in the galaxy. Races that had been conquered by the Centauri began to whisper among themselves. If humans could fight back, maybe they could too. The collective's reputation for invincibility was starting to crack. In the underground resistance movements of a dozen worlds, leaders heard about the battle and felt something they had not felt in years. Hope. The Centauri were not unbeatable. They could be hurt. They could lose. All it took was the courage to fight and the will to never give up. The Centauri High Council received reports of the Mars defeat with alarm. This was not supposed to happen. Primitive species did not win battles against the collective. They certainly did not recapture territory. The Council authorized the deployment of even more forces. They would crush humanity with overwhelming numbers. But Admiral Bennett was already planning his next move. He had learned the most important lesson of warfare. The enemy's strength could become their weakness if you knew how to exploit it. The Centauri relied on their technology and their numbers. Take those advantages away, and they had nothing left. 6 months into the war, the Centauri collective was facing a crisis. The High Council met in their chamber on the capital world, watching reports from the human front with growing disbelief. What should have been a simple subjugation campaign had turned into the costliest military operation in 500 years. The numbers were staggering. Over 200 Xanthari ships destroyed, tens of thousands of soldiers dead, supply lines constantly disrupted, occupied territories requiring massive garrison forces just to maintain minimal control. And worst of all, the humans were not weakening. They were getting stronger. Commander Nina Torres stood on the bridge of her ship reviewing the intelligence reports about other species in the galaxy. Nina had been a diplomat before the war, specializing in xenocultural studies. Admiral Bennett had asked her to lead a special mission, one that could change the entire nature of the conflict. Her target was the Vaxil, a species that had been conquered by the Xanthari 2 centuries ago. The Vaxil homeworld was located 3 systems away from human space, close enough for a fast ship to reach, but far enough that the Xanthari might not immediately notice. Nina's mission was simple but dangerous. Make contact with the Vaxil and tell them the truth. The journey took 5 days. Nina traveled alone in a small, fast courier ship, painted to look like debris. When she reached the Vaxil system, she broadcast on frequencies that the Xanthari did not monitor, ones that Earth's intelligence services had identified as used by the Vaxil resistance movement. The response came 3 hours later. A small shuttle met Nina's ship in the shadow of one of the system's outer planets. She boarded and found herself facing 3 Vaxil leaders. They were tall beings with blue skin and large expressive eyes. They looked tired and suspicious. Nina explained who she was and why she had come. Earth was at war with the Xanthari and winning. This fact alone made the Vaxil's eyes widen. She showed them recordings of battles, documented ship losses, captured territory. The evidence was clear. The mighty Xanthari collective was being beaten by a species they had never heard of 6 months ago. One of the Vaxil leaders asked the obvious question: how? Nina spent the next hour explaining human history, the centuries of warfare that had shaped human thinking. She described tactics like guerrilla fighting, psychological warfare, and strategic deception, concepts that were alien to the Vaxil but devastatingly effective. The Vaxil leaders listened with growing excitement. For 200 years they had served the collective, believing resistance was impossible. Now this human was telling them it could be done. Nina made her offer. Earth would share its knowledge and tactics with any species willing to fight for their freedom. Together they could break the collective's power. The meeting lasted all night. By dawn on the Vaxil homeworld, the resistance leaders had made their decision. They would begin small, testing what they learned from Nina. If it worked, they would escalate. Nina left them with detailed documents on human resistance tactics and promised that Earth would provide support when the time came. Back on Earth, Major Chris Powell was about to become a legend. He commanded New Geneva Station, a massive orbital platform that served as a shipyard, supply depot, and military stronghold. Intelligence reports indicated that the Xanthari were massing a huge fleet for an assault on the station. If it fell, Earth's ability to build and repair ships would be crippled. The Xanthari fleet arrived 3 days later. Over 100 warships, the largest concentration of force they had deployed since the invasion began. They came in confident, expecting to overwhelm the station's defenses through sheer firepower. They found something very different. Chris had spent weeks preparing for this moment. The station's weapons had been upgraded with every trick Dr. Lisa Morgan's team had developed. EMP cannons, kinetic accelerators, even experimental weapons that used gravity to crush enemy ships. But weapons were only part of his plan. The battle began with the Xanthari executing a classic encirclement maneuver. Their ships surrounded the station, preparing to fire from all directions simultaneously. Chris let them get into position, watching his tactical display with calm focus. When they were exactly where he wanted them, he gave the order. The station was not alone. 30 human ships had been hiding in its shadow, powered down and invisible to Xanthari sensors. They lit up their engines and attacked, catching the alien fleet from behind. At the same moment, the station itself began to move. It had been equipped with powerful engines that allowed it to maneuver like a ship, despite its enormous size. The Xanthari formation collapsed into chaos. They had expected a static defense, not a mobile battle station supported by hidden forces. Chris pressed his advantage, using his knowledge of Xanthari psychology. He broadcast fake distress signals that drew enemy ships out of position. He had his ships execute feigned retreats that lured the Zenthari into kill zones filled with mines. The battle raged for 3 days without pause. The Zenthari kept throwing ships at the station, unwilling to admit defeat. Chris's forces fought with a mix of courage and cunning that left the enemy commanders baffled. Human ships rammed Zenthari vessels at critical moments. Pilots ejected in escape pods, then remote piloted their unmanned fighters into enemy formations. On the second day, Chris pulled off his most audacious move. A damaged human destroyer, engines failing and life support critical, sent a surrender signal to the Zenthari flagship. The alien commander, eager for any victory, ordered the destroyer brought alongside for capture. As soon as the ships were close enough, the destroyer's crew evacuated, and the entire vessel detonated in a massive explosion. The Zenthari flagship survived, but barely. Its commanders stared at the wreckage in shock. Surrender was supposed to mean the fighting stopped. These humans had used surrender itself as a weapon. It was dishonorable, unthinkable, and terrifyingly effective. By the end of the third day, the Zenthari fleet retreated. They had lost 47 ships and accomplished nothing. The story of New Geneva Station spread through both human and alien forces. Chris Powell became a symbol of human resistance, the man who held the line against impossible odds. Dr. Lisa Morgan achieved another breakthrough during this period. Her team had been working on ways to disrupt Zenthari communications. The aliens used quantum entanglement for instantaneous messaging across vast distances, a technology humans were only beginning to understand. Lisa could not replicate it, but she found she could disrupt it. The quantum interference device was small enough to fit on a missile. When detonated near a Zenthari fleet, it would scramble their communications for hours. Ships could not coordinate, commanders could not give orders, and fleets became collections of individual vessels acting without unified strategy. Admiral Bennett immediately saw the potential. He ordered the devices mass-produced and distributed to every human ship and ground force. The next time Zenthari forces attacked, they found themselves unable to communicate. Human forces exploited this ruthlessly, using coordinated strikes against confused and isolated enemy units. Ambassador Claire Mitchell was meanwhile working on the diplomatic front. Claire had spent her career studying alien psychology and culture. Now she used that knowledge to reach out to other species in the galaxy. Her message was simple but powerful. The Zenthari maintained their control through fear and the illusion of invincibility. Humanity had shattered that illusion. Claire made contact with 7 different species that secretly resented Zenthari rule. She offered them the same deal Nina had given the Vaxil: knowledge, tactics, and support in exchange for their willingness to resist. Some species were too afraid to act. Others began quiet preparations for rebellion. The Zenthari leadership finally attempted diplomacy. A peace delegation arrived at Earth, authorized to offer humanity independence in exchange for an immediate ceasefire. The delegation met with Admiral Bennett and President Martinez in the ruins of what had once been Chicago. The chief Zenthari diplomat was shocked by the destruction. The city had been heavily damaged during the fighting, but humans were already rebuilding. Construction crews worked around the clock. Children played in the streets despite the war. The people seemed determined not just to survive, but to thrive. The diplomat presented the Zenthari offer: full recognition of human sovereignty, no tribute or vassalage required, peaceful coexistence. All Earth had to do was stop fighting and allow the Zenthari to withdraw with dignity. It seemed like a generous offer, and many on Earth's leadership council wanted to accept. Admiral Bennett listened politely, then presented Earth's counteroffer: complete Zenthari withdrawal from all occupied territories, not just Earth, but every system they controlled. Reparations for the damage caused by the invasion, and a formal guarantee that the collective would never again attempt to subjugate any species without consent. The Zenthari diplomat was stunned. These demands were outrageous. The collective had never paid reparations to anyone. They certainly would not change their entire foreign policy, because one stubborn species had refused to surrender. The diplomat rejected Bennett's terms and prepared to leave. Before the delegation departed, Bennett showed them something: a map of the galaxy with markers indicating every species that had contacted Earth in secret, 7 different races, all asking for help against the collective. The fleet that assembled for Operation Endgame was unlike anything humanity had ever created. 200 warships floated in formation near Earth's moon. their hulls bearing the scars of months of fighting. These were not the exploration vessels that had first encountered the Zenthari. These were weapons of war, built by a species that had learned the hard way how to survive. Admiral Kyle Bennett stood on the bridge of his flagship, the Defiant, watching the final preparations. Around him, his crew worked with quiet efficiency. They knew what they were about to attempt. An attack on the Zenthari home system was either brilliant or insane, possibly both. But after everything the aliens had done, after all the destruction and death, Earth was ready to deliver a message that could not be ignored. The fleet was not alone. Ships from 6 different species had joined them, representing the resistance movements that Commander Nina Torres had contacted. The Vaxil contributed 30 vessels. Other species added smaller contingents. These ships were not as advanced as Zenthari or human vessels, but their crews were determined. For the first time in centuries, the conquered species of the galaxy were fighting back. Captain Jake Morrison commanded the Defiant alongside Bennett. He had survived the destruction of the Aurora and spent the war rebuilding his strength and his resolve. Now he would return to face the species that had tried to kill him. He checked the tactical displays, confirming that all ships were ready for the jump to faster-than-light speeds. Bennett gave the order. Space twisted and bent as 200 human ships and 50 allied vessels vanished, reappearing moments later in the heart of Zenthari space. The home system was a massive star with 6 planets, the third one hosting the capital world of the collective. Defensive platforms and military stations orbited every major body. It was the most heavily defended location in the galaxy. The Zenthari defenders were caught completely off guard. No one had ever attacked this system. The mere thought was unthinkable. Yet here was a fleet of humans and rebels, dropping out of faster-than-light travel right in their home. Alarms shrieked across 1,000 stations as the defenders scrambled to respond. Jake Morrison launched the first strike. Missiles equipped with Dr. Lisa Morgan's quantum interference devices streaked toward Zenthari communication hubs. They detonated in brilliant flashes, and suddenly the defenders could not coordinate. Individual ships and stations fought independently, following their last orders without knowing what anyone else was doing. The human fleet split into attack groups, each with a specific target. One group went after the orbital defense platforms. Another attacked the shipyards where new Zenthari vessels were built. A third moved to engage the defense fleet that was trying to organize a response. The Allied ships provided support, using their knowledge of Zenthari systems to guide the humans to critical targets. The battle was chaos. Zenthari ships were powerful, but they were designed for orderly combat against inferior opponents. Human tactics were anything but orderly. Ships appeared where they should not be, attacked from impossible angles, used weapons in ways the Zenthari had never anticipated. The defenders found themselves fighting a battle they did not understand, against an enemy that refused to follow any rules. Major Chris Powell led a boarding action against one of the main orbital platforms. His Marines used small assault shuttles to punch through the platform's shields during a moment when they flickered from battle damage. Once inside, they fought room by room, using human close-quarters combat techniques that the Zenthari had no training for. The platform's defenders were shocked to find humans fighting hand-to-hand when they could have just blown the station up from outside, but that was not how humans thought. They wanted to capture the facility intact, use it against its former owners. It was aggressive and risky and completely unexpected. Meanwhile, Commander Nina Torres led her ships against a Zenthari ammunition depot in the outer system. The depot was supposed to be invulnerable, surrounded by minefields and automated defense systems. Nina used a trick that Frank Hudson had pioneered on Earth. She broadcast fake identification codes, making her ships look like returning Zenthari patrols. By the time the depot realized the deception, Nina's forces were already inside their defensive perimeter. The depot exploded in a blast, visible from the capital planet. Zenthari civilians, who had never witnessed warfare in their own system, stared up at the sky in horror as their military infrastructure burned. The Invincible Collective was under attack, and they were losing. The Zenthari High Council met in emergency session. They watched the tactical displays showing red icons marking destroyed stations and ships. In 6 hours of fighting, they had lost more assets than in the previous decade of warfare. Council members argued frantically about what to do. Some wanted to negotiate, others demanded they fight to the last ship. A few simply sat in shock, unable to process what was happening. Admiral Bennett broadcast a message directly to the council chambers. Earth had no desire to destroy the Xanthari people or their civilization. Humanity was not interested in conquest or revenge, but the collective would surrender, and it would surrender now. Every moment they delayed, more ships would burn and more lives would be lost. The choice was theirs. The message included something else. Evidence of the resistance movements across the galaxy, now openly fighting against Xanthari forces. The Vaxil had seized 3 systems. Other species were in open rebellion. The collective's empire was collapsing, and it was collapsing fast. The Xanthari could negotiate with Earth and try to salvage something, or they could fight on and lose everything. Diplomat Vex, the same crystalline being who had first met Jake Morrison, was the one who finally convinced the council. Vex had studied humanity after that initial encounter, trying to understand what made them different. Now watching Earth's fleet tear through Xanthari defenses, Vex understood. Humans were not just warriors. They were survivors who had turned survival into an art form. Vex composed a message to Admiral Bennett. The collective would accept Earth's terms. They would withdraw from occupied territories and pay reparations. They would reform their policies regarding new species. Vex included one question. Why? Humanity had won. They could demand anything. Why settle for mere peace? Bennett's response was simple. Because peace was what humanity had wanted from the beginning. Earth had not asked for this war. The Xanthari had forced it upon them. Now that the fighting was over, humans wanted to return to what they did best. Exploring, learning, building. War was something humans were good at, but it was not what they wanted to be. The formal surrender came 2 days later. The Xanthari collective agreed to dissolve, with each member species granted full independence. A new galactic coalition would be formed, based on voluntary cooperation instead of forced hierarchy. Earth would provide military support to any species threatened by aggression, ensuring that the strong could not simply dominate the weak. Dr. Lisa Morgan stood in her laboratory, looking at the pieces of Xanthari technology that had started this whole journey. Her team had learned so much, advanced human science by decades in just a few months. But the cost had been terrible. Millions dead, entire cities destroyed. She wondered if the knowledge was worth the price. Ambassador Claire Mitchell worked tirelessly to establish the new galactic order. She met with leaders from dozens of species, helping them navigate the transition from collective rule to independence. Many were afraid, uncertain if they could survive without Xanthari protection. Claire assured them that Earth would stand with them, not as conquerors but as allies. 5 years passed. The war became history, though its effects would be felt for generations. Earth rebuilt its damaged cities and mourned its dead. The defense fleet remained strong, but most ships were decommissioned or converted back to exploration and research vessels. Humanity had proven it could fight, but it chose to pursue peace. Commander Nina Torres, now retired from military service, became an instructor at the new Galactic Defense Academy on Earth. Students from 30 different species attended, learning military strategy and tactics from human veterans. Nina taught them about asymmetric warfare, psychological operations, and the importance of adaptability. One day, a young Vaxil officer asked Nina a question that many students wondered about. Why did humans teach other species their military secrets? Were they not afraid that someday someone would use that knowledge against Earth? Nina smiled. It was the same smile Admiral Bennett had worn when the Xanthari asked why humanity settled for peace instead of domination. She explained that peace could only exist when everyone was strong enough to defend themselves. The Xanthari had enslaved others because they could. Earth freed others because they believed freedom was worth fighting for. Besides, Nina added, if someone did eventually threaten Earth, humans would adapt. That was what they did best. Every challenge made them stronger. Every fight taught them something new. Humanity did not fear the future because they had survived the past. Captain Jake Morrison took command of a new exploration vessel, the Aurora II. He led missions into unexplored regions of the galaxy, making peaceful contact with new species. When he encountered aggressive civilizations, he followed a simple protocol. Offer friendship first. Show